Hello everyone and welcome back to another installment from our series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. Reporting for Scope 2 emissions has evolved with the introduction of market-based tools in Australia and New Zealand. In this joint webinar with thinkstep-anz and Toitū Envirocare, learn about the options and requirements of energy reporting in Scope 2 under the greenhouse gas accounting standards. Scope 2 emissions are classed as the indirect emissions from purchased electricity, steam, and heating or cooling. Market-based Scope 2 reporting looks at how to communicate your renewable energy purchases. Here's a sneak preview.
So what are Scope 2 emissions? They come from generating purchased electricity. For us at ThinkStep, for example, it's lighting and heating our office spaces. And this is also where we will be focusing on today, on electricity. But note that Scope 2 also cover emissions from purchased steam, heat, and from cooling.
Renewable energy certificates are used to address just the Scope 2 indirect greenhouse gas emissions associated with purchased electricity by verifying the use of zero or low emissions renewable sources of electricity. Offsetting through purchasing your carbon credits neutralises your emissions, while market-based reporting is reducing the reported emissions from your purchased electricity. And the difference there leads to different claims relating to your emissions. We provide guidance around the risks and benefits associated with the use of those market-based reporting to support our clients to make robust claims.
In this webinar, find out what location and market-based Scope 2 reporting means for Scope 2 reductions, offsetting and Toitū Envirocare carbon program certifications. With that, let's get started.
Hello and a warm welcome back to the thinkstep-anz webinar series. My name is Christin Schaller, Senior Sustainability Specialist at thinkstep-anz, and I'm your host for the next half an hour. Today we focus on measuring and reporting your Scope 2 emissions, and it's great to have such a big audience today. So thank you for joining us. In case you don't know thinkstep-anz, we are a sustainability firm with offices in Australia and New Zealand. And we help organizations to succeed sustainably for more than 16 years. And this ranges from strategic sustainability projects to more data-driven assessments, just like carbon footprints or life cycle assessments. So today we're joined by Dr. Belinda, General Manager Technical at Toitū Envirocare, which is fantastic. Belinda has a PhD in chemical engineering from Monash University. She manages Toitū's technical team, including the work on Scope 2 emissions for clients. Thank you, Belinda. We're excited to have you join us. Today we're looking at Scope 2 reporting with focus on market-based instruments. I'll first give a general overview and some definitions, and Belinda will then take over and provide more information around offsets, Toitū certifications, Scope 2 reductions, and audits. So what are Scope 2 emissions? They come from generating purchased electricity. For us at ThinkStep, for example, it's lighting and heating our office spaces. And this is also where we will be focusing on today, on electricity. But note that Scope 2 also cover emissions from purchased steam, heat, and from cooling. For example, the pulp and paper industry uses steam and heat for their processing of wood. Note that emissions from electricity can also be covered in other scopes. For example, a company that purchases 100% of electricity from the national grid, which is covered under Scope 2, also has electricity emissions in Scope 3, which come from transmission and distribution losses, for example. Another example is a company that produces 100% of their electricity, say in a diesel generator, and these would be sitting in Scope 1 and there wouldn't be any Scope 2 or 3 emissions. So when reporting Scope 2, you should use either the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, specifically the Scope 2 guidance, or ISO 14064 Part 1. These are the most important and globally recognized standards, and they are very similar. Both mandate the so-called location-based Scope 2 accounting as a minimum. And the Ghg Protocol also requires a second method called the market-based accounting for markets where it is possible. And this requirement by the Ghg Protocol is referred to as dual reporting. The ISO standard permits market-based reporting, but does not require it. So let's have a closer look at these two accounting methods. Traditionally, electricity emissions were calculated using a location-based emission factor, which reflects average grid emissions. This is, for example, a geographic area. Say in New Zealand, we have one electricity grid mix emission factor, and in Australia, there is one for the whole country, but also state-specific emission factors. As the interest in renewable energy has increased, energy retailers develop contractual instruments to let consumers buy their electricity from a specific, say, a renewable source. This means that market-based reporting reflects the consumer's choices. To prevent double counting of energy that is covered through these contracts, market-based reporting uses a so-called residual grid mix factor. This factor removes quantities covered by contracts from the average grid mix, which also means the residual grid mix is usually a little bit higher than the average grid mix. And under the market-based method, organizations must use the residual grid mix factor for electricity that is not covered by contractual instruments. I've prepared a little example that shows how to calculate location-based and market-based scope 2. So we have an average grid mix of 0.76 in this example and a residual of 0.92. That's higher because we've taken out the renewable stuff. And this reflects more or less the situation of Australia. So if we assume that we consume 100 kilowatt hours of electricity, the location-based scope 2 would be using the average grid mix and would result in 76 kg CO2e. Option 1 under the market-based method assumes that no contracts were purchased and the residual grid mix, 0.92, was applied to the 100 kilowatt hours, resulting in 92 kg CO2e. Option 2 assumes that we have purchased 50% of our electricity under a contract, reflecting 0 emissions. And then the remaining 50 kilowatt hours need to be covered with the residual grid mix again, and that results in 46 kg CO2e. So these examples just show that the results are quite different between the two methods, but also highly depend on the percentage of electricity that are covered by a contract, and also highly depend on the residual grid mix of each geographic area. For example, in New Zealand, the difference between location-based and market-based would be much, much different and much smaller. So there are 3 main categories of market-based instruments, which are mostly available for electricity at the moment. The first one are energy attribute certificates. These include renewable energy certificates, also known as RECs. The second one are contracts. These include power purchase agreements, typically used by larger companies who have direct contracts with a specific energy generator. And the third one are supplier utility emissions rates. Please consider that all of the instruments listed above must meet the scope 2 quality criteria, which are defined by the Ghg Protocol. I won't explain them now in detail, but one criteria, for example, is that the instruments must be unique to avoid double counting. And then, as mentioned, a residual grid mix should be provided. Again, a couple of examples of market-based instruments in New Zealand are the New Zealand energy certificates provided by the New Zealand Energy Certificate System, NZECS, which can be bought via the electricity retailers, and then Ecotricity, which is a renewable electricity retailer. In Australia, examples for market-based instruments are large-scale generation certificates, LGCs, and green power, which is offered by most electricity retailers in Australia as well. So there isn't a complete registry or tracking system that covers all instruments available or provides a complete residual grid mix factor in neither New Zealand nor in Australia. But when it comes to sources for residual grid mix factors, in New Zealand, the NZECS provides residual grid mix factors. However, these only cover their certificates. And in Australia, Climate Active provides a methodology around how to calculate a residual grid mix. This is on a national basis, which is a bit problematic just because the emissions intensity differs so much between different Australian states. Yeah, and that was a short overview from me around the definitions. And now I'd like to hand over to Belinda.
Great. Thank you, Christine. Great to have the opportunity to work together with Christine and thinkstep-anz on today's webinar. So, thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to talk a little bit more about market-based reporting and versus offsetting, and a bit about how we apply market-based reporting in our schemes, our carbon zero and carbon reduce programs. One question that does often come up by our clients and others in relation to market-based reporting is what the difference is between market-based reporting and renewable energy certificates or offsetting. So they're not the same thing. They have different underlying purposes. So some of the key differences are shown in this slide, but I won't talk through every last thing that's in here. At a high level, offsetting is used to compensate for your direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions by funding projects outside your organisation's value chain that avoid emissions or remove emissions from the atmosphere. Offsets or carbon credits are subtracted from your total organisational emissions to determine your net emissions. So you're effectively compensating for your greenhouse gas emissions, but you're not reducing them. So the projects for carbon credits need to be independently assessed against a number of principles. Renewable energy certificates are used to address just the Scope 2 indirect greenhouse gas emissions associated with purchased electricity by verifying the use of zero or low emissions renewable sources of electricity. Renewable energy certificates are measured as megawatt hours of renewable energy as opposed to tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. And they're used in the calculation of your gross market-based Scope 2 emissions based on the emissions factor associated with that renewable generation, which effectively means you're reporting lower Scope 2 emissions. And there are a number of quality criteria apply, as Christine said. Offsetting through purchasing your carbon credits neutralises your emissions, while market-based reporting is reducing the reported emissions from your purchased electricity. And the difference there leads to different claims relating to your emissions. If you offset your emissions, you can say that you've compensated for your greenhouse gas emissions effectively through financing emissions avoidance or reduction projects outside your organisation's operations. Whereas if you're purchasing renewable energy certificates or using other market-based mechanisms, you can claim that you're using renewable electricity from a low or zero emissions source. Another area that is different is the additionality space. In terms of additionality, greenhouse gas reduction projects are additional if they wouldn't have happened in the absence of a carbon credit market, effectively. So whether those projects would have existed without the funding that carbon credits provide. If the reductions would have happened anyway, then they fail the additionality test. Additionality is required for carbon credits. It's not required for renewable energy certificates. Because that additionality is not required for market-based reporting or for renewable energy certificates, it means that there is the potential to report reduced emissions, even though nothing's actually changed yet in the electricity generation landscape in New Zealand. The way we deal with these within our programs, we wanted to make sure that the use of renewable energy certificates and other market-based instruments within our programs is robust and really drives global emissions reductions. ISO 14064 Part 1 allows market-based Scope 2 reporting for energy attribute certificates and other market-based mechanisms, but it's still mandatory to calculate your emissions using the grid average factor as well, as Christine said earlier. So you end up with dual reporting in two different emissions numbers. This means that you've got to decide which of those two numbers you use to calculate your emissions reductions and to work out how many carbon credits you need to buy if you're aiming for net carbon zero certification. So for our Toitū Carbon Zero or carbon programs, we've decided that we will allow our program clients to report market-based emissions in line with the standards, as you'd expect. We do recommend the dual reporting of both location-based, which is mandatory, and that market-based electricity emissions. We provide guidance around the risks and benefits associated with the use of those market-based reporting to support our clients to make robust claims. We allow our program clients to report on emissions reductions based on either the location-based or the market-based emissions, provided that the basis of their calculations is clear and consistent year on year, and provided that the acceptance criteria that I'll talk about soon are met. If the renewable energy certificates purchased don't comply with those requirements, then they won't be accepted for reporting those emissions reductions. We allow our clients to offset their emissions based on either the location-based or the market-based emissions, provided that the basis is clear and transparent, so that people have to publicly, organisations have to publicly state whether they're reporting their offsetting based on location-based or market-based approach. We are clear in our public disclosures, the basis of the calculations and some of the high-level details of the renewable energy certificate purchases. And we do also encourage our clients to be thinking about how to become energy efficient as well, because while the market-based reporting does allow you to report effectively a lower emissions factor for your electricity use, using less electricity is really important too, because you're effectively freeing up more renewable energy for others to use. So we talked a lot about that approach as we were working out which way to go. We feel that this approach aligns with the principles of ISO 14064 Part 1 around relevance, consistency and transparency, as well as ISO 14065 principles of fair presentation and risk-based approach. So we really thought that those things were quite important considerations. Given that Toitū is all about reducing emissions and the standard that underlies our carbon programs does allow market-based reporting, we wanted to make sure that real emissions reductions were happening somewhere in the New Zealand emissions landscape as a result of any renewable energy certificates reported under our programs, and that they're also helping New Zealand to contribute to its national emissions reduction targets. That got us thinking about increasing New Zealand's ability to use renewable energy, as well as promoting energy efficiency. So we've got 4 criteria that we've come up with at this stage. We do review the criteria regularly, but at the moment the criteria are as listed on the slide there. Demand response, or reducing peak electricity use, will help to reduce the need to run our fossil fuel power stations during peak electricity use periods, which is when they're currently most needed. Facilities built since New Zealand's NDC baseline year of 2005 contribute to New Zealand's ability to meet our international goals. Ensuring that the funds generated through the purchase of renewable energy certificates are ring-fenced for funding new renewable generation will help drive that construction of new renewable generation facilities, and using funds to drive emissions reductions elsewhere in the sector, such as funding community EV charging or other emissions reductions projects that wouldn't otherwise happen, also has a benefit to New Zealand. So those may change with time, but we've had them sitting there for the last couple of years and they seem to be working pretty well at the moment. So if you do want to use market-based reporting as the basis of your emissions measurement, reduction and offsetting under Toitū's carbon programs, you need to show your auditor evidence that you have reported in accordance with the relevant standards, that you actually have purchased those renewable energy certificates and that they meet our criteria. We have worked with or been in touch with a number of the generators around New Zealand, where at a high level they're using the funds for consistent purposes. So it might be that we can effectively let you know that yes, the generator you've provided is fine, so you don't have to do a whole lot more work. So do talk to people around that too. And our reporting platform eManage is being updated so that that sort of enables that dual reporting as well. So that's really all the slides that I've got at the moment. I hope that's given you a wee bit of an insight as to the difference between carbon credits or offsetting and market-based reporting, as well as how market-based reporting fits into Toitū's schemes. So I'll hand back to Christine for questions and any further comment.
That was really, really helpful, and especially just so good to see and learn about the Toitū criteria that are applied, and are just kind of the extra step in addition to what the standards requiring to ensure that there is real emissions reductions in New Zealand. I guess now it's your turn. Please let us know your questions. I've seen that a couple of questions were already coming through, but please feel free to just pop them into the Q&A field at the bottom. Belinda, I'll just grab the first one and address it to you. So we got a question that reads, if we purchase energy from a generator who claims they produce 100% renewable energy, for example, Meridian, but we don't have a certificate, can we account for that? What would be your reply to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Effectively, if you haven't got a renewable energy certificate associated with that energy generation, then it's not feeding into that residual supply mix factor. So it's those electricity emissions or the electricity amount isn't being taken out of the broader pool effectively. So even though you may be using a supplier that does generate entirely renewably, if you haven't got a renewable energy certificate to back that up, then you just use your location-based, or you report the residual supply mix factor.
Perfect. Thank you. I hope that answered the question, but that's it. There was a easy question that I can cover. Is dual reporting mandatory under the Ghg Protocol? Yes, it is.
There is a question there about, does a renewable energy certificate instrument actually assist with the reduction of emissions, or does it simply allow a company to meet their carbon targets but continues to allow other companies to purchase from non-renewable sources? That is one of the areas that makes renewable energy certificates a little bit contentious. Initially, renewable energy certificates were set up in markets with quite low levels of renewable energy generation. And in those markets, there's quite soon a market to drive generation or new renewable generation to be constructed. In New Zealand, there has been comment that because we've got such high renewable electricity generation at the moment, that's a much higher threshold that needs to be met, a lot more renewable energy certificates that need to be sold before you're really sort of using the market to drive the generation of new. So the answer possibly at the moment is to start with, while the market's small, it might not be driving the construction of new renewable generation facilities, but the aim is that over time we would get to the point that it is driving that market.
Yeah, no, thanks, Belinda. It's just like setting up the system, right, to be able to.
That's right, and I guess another reason it's useful for some businesses to have that market available within New Zealand is that there are a number of large sort of multinational companies where there is a driver from sort of global, corporate to be using renewable energy certificates, and they just haven't been available in New Zealand, so that hasn't been something that has been able to happen.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm seeing one about SBTi's acceptance around RECs. So SBTi is the Science-Based Targets Initiative that provides guidance around developing reduction targets, and they require you to define whether you set your reduction target for Scope 2 on a market-based or location-based basis, and therefore they can be considered. There's also the option for Scope 2 to set renewable energy targets that are just focused on the purchasing of renewable electricity certificates or instruments in general.
I see we've got a point of clarification from Tim Street, who works for NZECS. point of clarification, PPAs and energy attribute certificates are not necessarily alternatives. A party could trade a power purchase agreement and then request it be tracked via energy certificates to avoid the risk of double counting and ensure the residual supply mix is updated accordingly. So thank you, Tim, for popping that in there as a point of clarification.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Tim. My list was not a unique list. That these are 3 options. Thanks for clarifying that. That's really useful. Yeah. There's another question around what is the best way to manage having market-based reporting in New Zealand, but location-based reporting in overseas offices. And I think that's what happens for many organizations at the moment, where there just isn't a market-based market available at the moment, and there aren't residual grid mixes. So for that case, you just use the location-based emission factor in your market-based reporting in the absence of market-based instruments. Is that what your answer would also have been, Belinda?
Yeah, that lines up with my thinking. I see Josephine has popped a question in. Ecotricity's carbon zero certification involves full life cycle emissions to be covered in its measurement, which is best practice. Do you think that renewable energy certificates will be required to expand their boundary in time? Hard to know at this stage, Josephine. It is a really good practice to understand the full life cycle associated with your electricity, and we love that Ecotricity does that. But I think in terms of the global standards, that's not currently something that's covered. So we hope that that's a future improvement.
The question is, does Toitū expect RECs to continue to be accepting going forward into the foreseeable future?
At this stage, we don't see any reason why they wouldn't be. They are internationally something that is, there's continuing markets for. It's why it's hard to look through a crystal ball. But I guess the interesting time will be when we get to the stage that all of New Zealand's electricity generation is renewable. So at that stage, all the emissions factors will be the same and will be zero, which will be great. But yeah, at this stage, in the short to medium term, we think that they're going to continue to be accepted.
Perfect. Thanks, Belinda. I know that there are a couple of questions that we weren't able to answer. For those who have left their names as in not anonymous, we will try to get back to you after this webinar. But if you have other questions, just feel free to get in touch with Belinda or I afterwards. It's time to wrap up. So thanks again, Belinda, for sharing your insights with us. And thanks to all of you for joining us. If you have any general topics or anything else that you would like us to cover in future webinars, please do let us know. And we're looking very forward to seeing you the next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.